Du er i øjeblikket en af de radioaktive og lytter til T-Radioen. Vores værter står klar til at give dig en smagsprøve på deres programmer og glæder sig til at møde dig. Vil du ikke gå glip af, når vi er live, så skynd dig at trykke på hjertet, så du følger vores side. Slå røven i sædet og giv en varm velkomst til vores næste program.
Hello.
Hi. Welcome back to Noise Complaint.
I almost dropped my microphone there. We're back from the potato holidays.
Yeah, we both had some journeys.
I'd like to thank Anne and Noemi for filling in last week. I heard they did a great job.
Yes, they
Very
did.
fun.
We had a lot of fun.
But yeah,
welcome back.
Welcome back. Thanks for tuning in again this Sunday afternoon. So today, what are we talking about?
Today we're going to talk about road trips, nice. The history of the road trip, the car, the role of music in the car, and sound in general.
Yeah. And the reasoning behind this is pretty simple. We went on a road trip this week with 6 others.
Mm-hmm. All 8 of us were in one van.
Yeah, one big van. Thanks to Anne and Steve for driving that van safely.
Yes.
And they started in Copenhagen.
Yeah, we started in Copenhagen, then we went to Odense.
Aarhus. I met you guys in Aarhus.
A farm near Aalborg.
Yes, with some puppies.
To the north.
To Skagen. The northernmost point is Denmark. And then back down through some nice places as well.
Yeah.
So we got back yesterday.
And we're here.
We're talking about road trips and cars and music. Okay, so maybe we get started.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Also, just like throughout the episode, if you have any songs or things that remind you of road trips,
please put it in the chat.
Yes, let us know.
And like and subscribe. Okay, so we're going to start with some history as normal. Most of this episode is going to center on the United States because that's where the car and the highway has been very central. But we're actually going to start in Europe. So in the 1600s and 1700s, so 300, 400 years ago, there was this tradition that started among very wealthy white 20-year-olds. Classic Europe history. And they these guys would go on these really big road trips. Essentially, it's called the Grand Tour, and it's basically a continental road trip that started often in the UK.
But like in the 1600s and the 1700s, were they using like horse and buggy?
Yeah, so I guess they would get on a boat from the UK because of course they went to Oxford or Cambridge, and then they stopped in France and would get a coach, like a horse-drawn coach. And then they would drive through Belgium, France, down into Italy, then go back up to Germany and other places. And essentially they were just starting to learn, I guess, culture. They would try to, master some languages, meet some people, network, early networking days. And these road trips could take like years.
So it's kind of like this program.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like 4 cities, but whiter and wealthier. Okay, but then in the 19th century, people sort of lost interest in this, and there was like trains and eventually cars and steamships, and that led to more mass tourism, like accessible tourism.
Yeah.
For lots of middle-class people, let's say.
So is that like the first time a lot of people were leaving their hometowns?
Yeah,
or were able to, I guess?
Yes, I wouldn't. Yeah, probably not a lot of people, but more and more people started over the late 19th century to go on trips, get out of their hometowns, and the steamship and the railroad made that possible. And the car eventually popped up, as we know, in the late 19th century. And the first official, let's say, road trip with a car happened in 1888 in Germany. So this woman named Bertha Benz, who was the wife of Karl Benz, inventor of the Benz motor car, she took their patent motor wagon, what it was called, and their 2 teenage boys, their sons, and drove about 105 kilometers or 65 miles throughout southwest Germany. She didn't even get permission from Karl Benz, her husband. It's very scandalous.
God forbid.
Yeah. But in doing so, she actually did very well for the company that would become Mercedes-Benz. So this first road trip was kind of a publicity stunt in certain ways and got people really excited about the car.
That rebellious aspect of the road trip, became symbolic in other pop culture we'll talk about later.
Yeah, so Bertha Benz, thanks to her, this rebellious road trip trend started. And musicians and sound designers around that time, around the 1900s, in the beginning of that 20th century, started to react to the car and in different ways. Some just tried to like make songs that were using recycling sounds or mimicking sounds of the car with instruments. So like I don't know, like the clanging of gears replicated with a drum, or different. Imagine like old timey instruments used to recreate sounds from the car, which was very new and very strange to people. Others tried to write songs about like this new invention in a more romantic sense. So there's one which we're going to play now, talking about sort of a love scenario coming out of a car. It's very, yeah, it'll bring you back to 1900 or 1905 when the song was originally written. Okay, thanks for listening to that banger from 1905. The interesting thing about that song, well, it's not that interesting, but General Motors used that song like for decades as different advertising jingles and ways to sell cars. But now we're going to move to France.
So if you know me, you know I'm kind of obsessed with food. And so, you know, the famous Michelin stars that like people obsess over now, and you know, the best restaurants have 1, 2, or 3 Michelin
Copenhagen
stars.
has a bunch, right?
Yeah, Copenhagen has a bunch actually. But so Michelin stars actually come from the Michelin Tire Company, which you know, is, I think a lot of people are not aware of that unless you actually like look into it. But it's a pretty interesting story. So it first originated in France, and because you know there was like a big passion for food in Lyon, especially. That was kind of like the origin of the French cuisine, some say. But so the Michelin Tire Company, you know, they wanted to have like a good marketing campaign that would promote people to use tires, and they were finding tires really hard to sell or to market because they're not they're, you know, a sexy product. So what they did is they started these Michelin tire guidebooks that would tell people great places to stop like through their road trip. And it wasn't just restaurants at the time. Like they had like different tourist attractions, hotels, and food was one of them. But food became the most popular section of the guidebook, and so
makes sense.
So the guidebook was first created in 1989. And so then when they realized that the food section became really popular, then they started making Michelin stars. So they would give stars to the best restaurants along routes in the road trip. And so the 3 stars, so like someone from the Michelin Tire Company would go to the restaurant,
like a tire expert, or like
I guess maybe at this point they had been like hiring freelance food critics.
I hope so.
I don't know. But so basically they started this 3-star system, and the system, which is still in place to this day, is referred to as Michelin stars. 3 is exceptional cuisine worth a special journey. So they even incorporated like the road trip into the star rating.
They're trying to sell.
Yeah. 2 stars is excellent cooking, worth a detour, but not worth its own journey, just worth a detour. And 1 star was a very good restaurant in its category. So I just think that's kind of a fun little story that goes to show that even this now something that's become like this really prestigious, almost snobby thing actually just started with like normal people taking road detours. Trips, and it's from a tire company that actually has nothing to do with food anymore. Really. But they thought it would be good publicity for the tires, for their company, and you know, Michelin is like a household name kind of.
It is, yeah. So. And probably a lot of people only know it from the restaurant industry. Yeah. Not from the tires. But.
Yeah. So that was a fun little story. And now I'm going to play Road to Nowhere by the Talking Heads, unrelated to Michelin stars. But if you listen to the lyrics, it's definitely road trip inspired. So. All right. So that song, Road to Nowhere, I think that's also one of the things about road trips that people like, is it's kind of symbolic for just like getting out of a place that you feel stuck in or something like that. So it can be inspiring and I think that's why there's so many songs and things about road trips.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
All right, back to more history. So Route 66 is a very important name and place and route for road trips and for the history of roads and cars in the United States. The idea behind Route 66 came up in the early 20th century, the creation of this route that would link Chicago in the Midwest to Los Angeles, which for some listeners in Europe, it's hard to visualize maybe how big that is, that stretch of land. But it's massive. That's a long distance.
Yeah, I think the funny thing that, I mean, just talking about Europeans' concept of distance and driving, when we were on our road trip this weekend, it was funny because our European friends were the ones driving, and they were like, oh my gosh, we have to switch every 2 hours because that's just like such a long time to be driving. But like Nelson and I are used to driving for like over like 10 hours at a time sometimes, which still is a long time, but like for us 2 hours was like,
right,
which I could drive
not
by myself.
Not to sound condescending.
Yeah, not condescending at all. It's just everything's relative.
Right.
Like where we were socialized to think that that was normal, whereas they had better transportation.
Yeah, exactly. I think both Belle and I would easily trade, quick, good public transportation for the long distances we've had to drive in our lives. But anyway, Route 66 came about in the early to mid 20th century, and it could have been Route 60 or Route 70, but they settled on Route 66, and I think that's important because it does kind of ring. It sort of rolls off the tongue, Route 66.
It's good branding.
Yeah, good branding, and it was good for local small towns around the Midwest and West, places like Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so these people, these boosters in these small towns, really tried to push for Route 66 to come through their town. And they did many different things to do this. So like advertising stunts, again, there was a transcontinental foot race, just like a race across the United States. And they really lobbied hard to get it to go along Route 66. And eventually, there were lots of romantic associations with migrant families, that tried to make it out west during the Great Depression in the 20s and 30s, during the Dust Bowl. Even though in reality, like historically, if you look at it, Route 60 and Route 70 actually trafficked more migrant families than Route 66. But something about Route 66 really hit a tone. And so you see it in, literary works like Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. And later on in the 20th century, it's just a very romantic concept. And so, for example, in terms of songs and music, there's this guy, Bobby Troup, who wrote a song while traveling along Route 66 with his wife, Cynthia. And the song, which we will play, mentions a lot of the towns and the cities along the route. And it was first recorded in 1946 by Nat King Cole. Cool. And it became an immediate hit, and you'll recognize it, at least you will have heard a cover of it from other groups. So here's Get Your Kicks on Route 66, sung by Nat King Cole. All right, that was Get Your Kicks. Actually, it's interesting about that song, Cynthia, Bobby Troup. So Bobby Troup wrote the song, and his wife Cynthia, basically made him call it Route 66. He was actually considering calling it Route 40, but just another example, like Bertha Benz, of a woman who's maybe a better advertiser, better promoter than her husband. So Get Your Kicks. This song actually helped cement Route 66 place in American imaginations about the open road, the Great West. And you can hear that in that song that you just heard, like that upright bass kind of walking along the background really makes you want to get up and move and go out and drive somewhere. Or at least it encaptures that feeling of kind of movement. So after the Second World War, we saw this explosion of cars and roads throughout the United States, which led to lots of roadside attractions along Route 66, but other places as well. And also you saw the rise of the motel, which many people might know is a shortening of motor hotel, motel. And this explosion of roads and all these things came because of some mythology and manifest destiny things that Bella will talk about in a bit. But it also came about from actual policy and people making decisions on the ground. So in 1956, there was a Federal Highway Act that was very important for roads in the United States. And actually my grandfather was a civic engineer in Idaho in the West. And he, designed many highway exits to go into his hometown in Coeur d'Alene. And So this was, definitely part of kind of film and culture and music, but it was also policy and planning things that we won't get super into. Yeah. But that's just to say that also, this song, Get Your Kicks, it reflected this new, or I guess a growth throughout the country through the highway.
Yeah. In like history courses and things like that, I had learned about the Federal Highway Act, but I guess I didn't really realize how much it increased accessibility in like a personal way until Ireland got a lot of money from the EU, like regional development funds, to create a motor highway that went across from Dublin to Galway. So that's like across from the east to the west. And it used to take like 4 to 6 hours to get across the country on these like smaller windy roads, and then they built this motor highway, and now it takes like 2 hours tops. And so it's so much more accessible, and it's a really small country. Like it never should have taken that long to get across, and it totally changed the way like we traveled in Ireland and things like that. And so then I was kind of like, wow, like the Highway Act happened so long ago in the US, but really it's in some places it's only just happening.
And it's interesting also. I mean, we often now, it's easy for, especially I think millennials like us, to criticize and to get really upset about, there's all these highways, cars, like why did this happen? But it make, I think, a lot of sense to a lot of people. If you're gonna, for example, cut travel time by a third or 2/3 in Ireland, or all these things, it's like it helped a lot of people get from one place to another, and it made travel and road trips much more accessible.
We didn't. I'm just realizing we didn't mention this now, and I am just thinking of it, which I probably should have thought of this before, which just like shows my privilege. But highways often are built through like low income neighborhoods of color, and they don't benefit everyone in the same way, and they've often like had a huge impact on like communities of color in urban spaces. So that's also an important thing to look into. Right.
So all generally the songs we're playing are very positive, kind of romantic and inspiring songs about the glory of the road and the road trip. But often those, the luxuries of being able to do a road trip come at the expense of marginalized communities throughout.
So moving on from that, I'm going to talk a bit about the radio or the sound system in the car, and how that, that wasn't always a thing, and kind of the evolution of that technology. So before 1930, there were no radios or like music or any sound in cars besides the engine. So I actually think that's interesting. Like you really could hear the engine so much before. So it's a totally different experience than we have now. And actually listening to music while driving was extremely controversial. Like they thought it was as bad as texting and driving. So
really, like it's just distracting, like you're gonna crash.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're like listening, singing, you're not paying attention to the road. So it wasn't really something that people thought made sense. And in 1930, the Galvin Manufacturing Company, they created this radio called the Motorola 5T71, which is a combination of automotive and Victrola. And they sold millions of car radios, but a lot of people were against it because of the distraction it would cause. And what's interesting is, so the Galvin company actually changed their name to Motorola Incorporated, and now they're the telecommunications company that we know. Yeah, but the name comes from the radio they invented for the car, which is the first car radio ever. So it's kind of
the things you learn.
Fact. Yeah. And then in 1956, there was a brand new music listening option in the car. It was an in-car phonograph called the Highway Hi-Fi, which I think is a fun name. And it was the
Highway Hi-Fi.
Yeah, and this was like a really big deal because it was the first time that people could customize what they wanted to listen to in the car. So how it worked was a miniature, if you flipped a switch in your car, like a miniature turntable came out. What? And you could put in these 7-inch records basically that Chrysler made, but they had this deal with Columbia Records, so Chrysler only made records of artists who were signed by
Chrysler
Columbia
made the records.
Yeah,
like a car company started making records,
specifically made them only with Columbia Records artists, and the record could play 45 minutes of music, and so people could bring their stack of records But it actually was like a terrible invention
Yeah.
because like records are super
Delicate,
delicate
yeah.
and the bumping and moving would scratch the
This-
record. The song would skip. Like
Oh
you
my
couldn't
gosh.
actually listen to
Yeah.
a song at all. So it was phased out in a couple years, and then AM and FM radio were like then still
Okay.
the main thing
Okay.
that people listened to. So that was like a complete waste. And it wasn't until 1964 that the compact cassette tape was invented in cars. And so this was also a huge invention because it was the first customizable option that worked in general.
Okay.
That was really widespread because it was affordable and it allowed you to make your own mixtapes and playlists. So this is the first time mixtapes and playlists like are a thing with road trips. People can
Okay.
kind of design their soundtrack for their trip. And they have to do it ahead of time, you know. It's not like now where you can just
like spontaneous,
exactly.
immediate playlists.
And you know, it's kind of cute. Like people would make mixtapes for each other. I mean, back in the day, I'm sure.
And now people, I'm sure, do it to feel some nostalgia for the past.
Exactly. But this was like people loved it because
Of course.
they didn't have to listen to what was on the radio. They had a choice, and it didn't have to be their choice of album. It could be choice of any song. So this was huge.
Designing their own, you know, sonic experience for the car.
Yeah,
it's pretty crazy.
Exactly.
But actually, one thing I want to talk about, the like the like record thing where you have the records in the car that come out, you know, that you described that invention, which didn't work out. It reminded me very like viscerally of driving as a kid, and we had in one of our cars like a it was like a CD player, but it had it was amazing because you could put, I don't know, 6 or 7, no, it was like 12 CDs into the thing, and it would be under the passenger seat.
Oh, that's great, because I talk about later the CD thing, but I didn't know it was under your
Ours
seat.
was under the seat, and
That's
it was
crazy.
really wild, and it was always an experience to try to like get the things out, and sometimes it skipped and all this stuff. Anyway, fun for me.
Whoa, super weird.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna continue on with the evolution of music technology in the car, but I thought to break it up a bit, we're gonna play a song, "Truckin'" by the Grateful Dead.
Cool.
All right, so that was kind of a long song, so I wasn't going to play the whole thing, but hope you enjoyed the break. So now we're back, and I'm going to start talking about the 1970s because, like I mentioned earlier, the cassette tapes were made in cars, and so people just got like really into the concept of making their own mixtapes for their road trips. And then in the 1970s, the aftermarket became really popular. So that's kind of like the section of the auto industry that's involved with parts and accessories being put into the car after the initial sale. Okay. So, you know, people were like buying these cars and then completely tearing the speaker system apart, putting in really fancy speakers, even crazier cassette players, things like that. And today, this is like still a huge market.
Yeah.
Like Pimp My Ride on MTV is like a whole
amazing show.
Whole show. So that, you know, became a huge part of the car industry. And then in 1984, Pioneer, they made the first car CD player. And this was a huge deal as well because it was the first option with instant track skipping. So like we're so used to a song coming on and just be like, yeah, skip this or go back. Yeah. And this was really the first time you could do that. So it was a huge deal for people.
Cool.
And multi-disc CD players, like Nelson was talking about, became a thing. So not only could you switch tracks, you could switch between albums. You didn't have to listen to one artist the whole way through. So I think it really changed how people listened to music.
Very cool.
And then lowriders. Yeah.
So the lowrider, like, you know, a car that like can go really low and then up, like you've seen in music videos where they're bouncing kind of. Those hydraulics of that was developed in the 60s, but in the 90s it became very important for hip hop culture, as you've seen in, you know, music videos for Dre and Snoop Dogg. And that to me is just an example of how the car became an instrument in its own way, and the road is like this performance space where you're literally like expressing your musical interests through the car, through this new machine.
And that actually became really important for minority communities in Los Angeles, especially. So I don't know if you've ever heard of Zoot Suits, but like the Latino community in Los Angeles really had to express their identity through culture because, like, you know, the government and the society was kind of
repressing
them. And so music and cars were really a way that the Latino community was able to express themselves. So like that was a huge, lowriders and zoot suits were like a huge part of expressing their culture, and playing songs and cruising in their lowride cars was really important. I totally forget the name of the article, but there's a really interesting article. So if you just look Google Scholar, like zoot suits, lowriders in Los Angeles, you'll be able to find it.
Cool.
Yeah. So then in the mid 2000s, there became new technology to connect MP3 players to the car, and that's kind of where we are today.
Yeah.
That's probably the main way people listen to music in the car. And even now, like, people still use the radio on the car, but podcasts are such a thing. Most people are playing like radio podcasts through their phones, so it's not even like necessarily listening to the radio in the car. And now, you know, we have all these streaming services, and
shout
Apple,
out to Twitch.
Yes, and Apple has CarPlay, so you're totally integrating these streaming services and your phone into the car now. And Uber actually has a deal with Spotify that, like, it's through the Uber app you can play your playlist on Spotify in the Uber you're in. Yeah. So we kind of have this crazy marketing like convergence of all these different technologies. So I mean, that's just like a crazy progression from the phonograph in the car to now, all the way to now your car is a computer.
Yeah, crazy. All right, let's talk about movies.
Yes.
So like the relationship between music and cars and road trips, obviously, as you guys already been thinking about in the chat, has become a central part of Hollywood. So the road trip movie, or the road film, maybe people call it that, can be considered its own genre.
Yeah, I was calling it a road trip movie, but then when I was reading actual like film study stuff, it was called the road film. So.
Okay, so the road film, there's your word for the day.
You learn something new.
Yeah,
every day.
So like examples include Easy Rider. Rafa mentioned that in the car yesterday to us. Thelma and Louise, classic. Ice Cube's Are We There Yet, classic. Rain Man, Borat. And I want to see the second Borat this week. Yeah.
Maybe we can weigh in on our opinion.
Maybe that's a road film as well. And you've done some research into more abstract ideas about the birth of the road film.
Yes, I have. So the birth of the road film kind of came about after World War II, in this post-war period, and the popularity of this genre of film kind of came about for two reasons, most film critics think. And the first one is, the advent of the automobile, as you were saying earlier, as a fund after World War II happened. And owning a car became a fundamental expression of individuality in America. You could go wherever you wanted. You kind of had this freedom that wasn't there before. So that became like a big part of expressing yourself in the post-war period. And then also there is an emergence of this large group of restless suburban youth, and the car was, their tool for exercising their freedom. They could leave the suburbs, go into the city, or even just driving around with their friends kind of gave them a break from the monotony of the 1950s suburban life. And then in the 1960s, these younger people who had grown up with the car being such a common family or suburban piece of technology, they actually started appropriating it from its 9-to-5 use and its like classic weekend leisure routine. And the car kind of became transformed into a literal vehicle for restlessness and rebellion. And the road trip became like this valorized rite of countercultural passage. So, I mean, I'm sure all of you have like seen these iconic images of like the VW van, and hippies in this van going to Woodstock, like these like really countercultural road trips.
Stuff that now pops up in your Instagram feeds as suggested advertisements for finding this van and going out west on the road trip.
Exactly. And so now it kind of is used as a branding strategy, but in the 60s it really was felt that this was countercultural and subversive to how societies had been using the car before that. That's reflected in films such as like Thelma and Louise is a really good example of this rebellious like fuck society aspect, 'cause it's two women in a car like rooting their own destiny, so That's an example.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
And now I'm gonna play a song, "Take Me Home, Country Roads" by John
Have you heard
Denver.
it? Have people heard this song? I don't
I'm
know.
sure you've all heard it. It's super famous. It's in a ton of films, road trip films or otherwise. And so the cover by Olivia Newton-John appears in this one film, Whisper of the Heart by Miyazaki. And the movie is like a really sweet movie. It's not necessarily about a road trip, but I think it gets to the like at the point of home and like love is home. And so it's these two Japanese teenagers, and the boy plays violin and the girl sings, and they like play the song together, and they fall in love, and he has to go to school, and they sing this song separately. So it's all about the song, which is like really random movie, but it's a good song.
But we're going to play the original. Is that okay?
Yeah, we're playing the original.
Okay, because I don't have that cover. Okay, here's Take Me Home, Country Roads.
Right, so just ending that song a bit early because we're running out of time and we're going to get through the rest of the things we want to talk about. My mom mentioned the book and movie Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and that also is actually very iconic film for being part of this rebellious road film genre.
Totally.
Using the car, the open road, going to Las Vegas, and drugs as a way of rebelling against the system and what the car is supposed to be used for by nuclear families. And so I want to talk a bit about the genre of road film and how it relates to Manifest Destiny, and how it relates to this literary tradition that's concerned with voyaging and the journey, and expansionism and imperialism, in the sense that people are asserting oneself in another place and they're finding themselves in somebody else's place. And this is like this idea, even though it sounds very critical, I think in some way is rooted in the way that we all see or are entitled to road trips in a way. But it's more like a thought exercise rather than saying don't go on road trips because it's expansionist or imperialist. But
it's definitely there. Like the idea that you're setting out to go to a new space and almost conquer it in a way in your head. I mean, that's a bit maybe extreme, but
I think the movies touch on it way more than actual road trips itself. But and because like road films then appear to be analogs of American official aggression, both imperialistic and domestic. And there's this tension between the rebellious critique of conservative authority I was talking about earlier with the 60s road films, and the reassertion of traditional expansionist ideology in some other road films. So I think, we can look at it's not one or the other. It kind of crosses the line.
A bit of both. Yeah. I think also in an abstract sense, there's something I was thinking about how with time and history and present and future with road trips. So bear with me. I'm about to get a bit abstract. But I think that road trips allow us to experience time in all directions, in a sense. So that's both visually and also in our imagination. So first we feel, when we're on a road trip, we feel this nostalgia for the past as we travel through the histories of places and spaces, through the histories of people who have been on this road before us. And we're simultaneously drawing our own history on that line, on that road as we go along. And we literally see that history fade behind us as we drive forward. So that's the past. The second, the present. So when you're on a road trip, we felt this, I think, the last few days. You feel this immediacy in the present, in the car, where you're listening to these songs we've been playing. You're seeing the landscape unfold right before your eyes. So it's not like a movie, it's real time. Although like music while you're driving does make you feel like you're in a music video.
But it's almost like I think that's a really good point, but it's almost like you're in your own movie.
Exactly.
So that's what makes it so easy to be present. And I find like I struggle with being present a lot, but this road trip, like I was super present in everything we were doing. And like singing together in the car kind of was very grounding and made me focus on literally what was right in front of me.
There's nothing else. You're locked in a box in a car moving.
It's like a good moment for self-analysis.
Exactly. Hopefully not too much self-analysis.
No, not too much.
And then finally, like the future. So you are on a road trip and you feel this energizing hope about your future, which you see in front of you as you're driving. And this road stretches out, let's say, infinitely on the horizon, and you're hopeful about what's coming next, about the next town you're stopping in, or your future after the road trip. And so Yeah, and you get excited about the next stop, but also about the next song, which for us is going to be a song by the Chicks, formerly known as the Dixie Chicks, Wide Open Spaces, which you'll see captures this kind of phenomenon of past, present, and future. So here it is, Wide Open Spaces. I love that song so much.
That's a good one.
We're out of time, but two things.
We even have more stuff to say.
We have more stuff to say, but we don't have enough time. But obviously, one thing that we didn't talk a ton about was the effect of road trips and cars generally on the environment. That is a huge topic. It's an episode in its own way. I think cars themselves make a lot of sounds that disrupt nature, and they also implicitly disrupt nature in other ways.
So while we're talking about the joys of listening to music in the car, we haven't quite talked about noise pollution the cars cause. Like on our road trip, we were driving through a nature preserve, and you know, that was silent and peaceful.
Not very nice for the cows.
Yeah.
No, but that's a serious topic that we didn't get into, so apologies for that. And also the issue of Corona and COVID and how it relates to road trips. I think a lot more people are going on road trips.
Yeah, because flying just isn't accessible safety-wise and cost-wise. Like tickets have gone up, and people don't want to be putting their health in danger. So I think road trips have definitely become more popular. Like just looking through my social media, so many people I know are now going on road trips with friends to places when they're moving or things like that, not flying anymore.
Yeah, different types of tourism amid this pandemic.
So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves throughout the next couple of years.
Totally. Okay, that's it for us. Come back next week, next Sunday, same time.
Yep, we'll see you then.
Thanks for listening, guys.
Bye.